Hey, welcome back, folks, to another episode of the American Civil War. I'm Tony Stevenson, and I'm glad to see you all here. We are starting 1864. Just, I want to stop and think about this for just a few moments. This is the fourth year of the Civil War as we're starting. It started in 1861, 2, 3. This is starting the fourth year. Just think about this. There have been hundreds of thousands of soldiers have been killed already in the Civil War. And, we don't have a lot of patience in America. That's one thing I've learned in my short years is that we kind of want immediate gratification. And I can think back to events like the Vietnam War. I can think back even to the war on terror that we went through for, it seemed like forever. Uh, and Americans lost a lot of patience pretty rapidly. Think about what the people in America must have been thinking as it entered into the fourth year on our soil, not just in some foreign country, but on our soil, all the lives that have been lost. And I think about this, and it makes me really appreciate even more the uh, persistence of the leaders of the Civil War, as well as the ability for the people to withstand all the horror and the terror that must have been in their hearts and their minds, losing their loved ones. So, with that being said, let's kind of review what we talked about last week. We looked at the events which followed Gettysburg, which were almost entirely in the Western Theater. However, we began looking by two events that kind of occurred in the Eastern Theater. The first one was the Union's decision to resort to conscription in order to resupply the manpower. And this resulted in draft riots. This is one of those kind of stories that you don't hear a lot about in the Civil War because people tend to focus on the military history. But there were some pretty serious draft riots in the Civil War, and particularly in New York City, where several hundred people were killed and many more imprisoned over it. So it was a pretty serious situation. And then we looked at the blockade of Charleston Harbor on the Eastern Theater, which again is kind of a follow through of Winfield Scott's idea of this anaconda plan where you squeeze the South into submission. And this was part of it. Charleston was not just a harbor, it was kind of the symbol. Remember, this is where the Civil War started. Next, we looked at Rosecrans' brilliant Tullahoma campaign in Mississippi. And again, it's one of these battles that seems to be lost because it occurred almost the same time as Vicksburg and Gettysburg, and people don't really hear much about the Tullahoma campaign. And yet, strategically and tactically, it was one of the most brilliant campaigns of the Civil War. And it is still being studied today in military academies because of Rosecrans's brilliance in devising this thing with very little loss of life. He forced Bragg out of Chattanooga, which the Union then, occupied Chattanooga, which was kind of the back door to Atlanta, which was a huge deal. It didn't turn out all that great because after they occupied Chattanooga, they went on the offensive again and were soundly defeated at what's called the Battle of Chickamauga, which is right on the northwestern corner of Georgia. And it was probably the last really big Confederate victory of the Civil War. They had other victories, as we'll see, but this was a big one, folks. This was right up there with some of the other, like Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg, and some of these. It was a huge victory. Uh, so much so that Bragg was able to force Rosecrans's troops back into Chattanooga, and he was able to lay siege to the city. The only thing that kept him from absolutely destroying Rosecrans' army was George Thomas, who stood by and was able to keep the Confederate armies from overwhelming the whole Union Army. He gained a nickname, the Rock of Chickamauga, and Thomas becomes kind of one of these heroes of the Civil War over this. And then we saw how Grant and Sherman were brought in to Chattanooga to take over the Union Army. Rosecrans, even though he had a brilliant campaign in the Tullahoma campaign, he went backwards at Chattanooga. And I don't know if it was PTSD. I don't know what happened to him, but he just absolutely fell apart. emotionally for a while. And so they brought Grant and Sherman in from their big victories over in Vicksburg and put them in charge of the Union Army. The result was that they were able to break the Southern siege uh, in a couple of battles called the Miracle Missionary Ridge, where Thomas again performed a just absolutely brilliant, offensive up Missionary Ridge. No one thought he could do it. And also Hooker. They brought Hooker back from where he had been beaten at Chancellorsville and brought him back. And he fought a battle on Lookout Mountain that's often called the Battle Above the Clouds because it was so high up on the mountains that clouds actually were formed on the below him. Ended the week last week by looking at the concluding battle of 1863, which was Burnside's troops being able to withstand an unsuccessful siege of Knoxville, Tennessee by Longstreet. And he ended up going back across the Appalachian Mountains and hooking back up with Lee. So this is what we did last week. So let's look at 1864. It's a real turning point in the war, folks. We've had a lot of turning points. I know you're probably thinking, it seems like every week I tell you there's a turning point. This is a pretty massive one because from this point on, you begin to see the North really gain the offensive and go on the war, and it is increasingly obvious that they are going to win the war. It's a battle of attrition at this point. Who has the most men, who has the most material, who's willing to keep going. That doesn't mean that the Union had it made, because they didn't. The South absolutely refused to give up. It seemed like that even though they'd had all these victories in the North, that the rebels just continued to want to fight to the death. Gettysburg and Vicksburg did not stop them. And they were not going to give up on their attempt to preserve their way of life, slavery. They did not want to give up on this. They just absolutely felt like it was a fight to the death, and it was in many of their minds. They had pretty much given up on the dream of having England and France come to their aid. They had kind of always hoped that one of these two countries would come to the aid, but that had pretty well been dropped, particularly after Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation, because that was kind of a dagger at the heart of the Confederacy as far as France and England, because they were very supportive of abolition. And at that point, they really couldn't turn their back on the Union. In the North, the public was really getting pretty antsy. Like I just said at the beginning, we want immediate gratification. And this was going to enter in the fourth year of the war. The numbers were piling up into the hundreds of thousands. People were really beginning to doubt whether or not old Father Abraham, and that's what a lot of people called him, was really knowing how to fight this war. They were beginning to wonder, does this guy really know what he's doing? Have we really chosen the right man to lead our country? Remember, 1864, what's coming up in November? A presidential election. And the result is that the Democrats were really hopeful that they were going to gain the government back. And in all honesty, they had a really good chance to do that. If it wouldn't have been for Sherman and Sheridan, they probably would have, in all honesty. They were out there with slogans that they were going to promise peace, even at the expense of allowing slavery to continue. So as it turned out, 1864 really would be a turning point. You would see Grant take total charge of all the federal troops. Grant would be brought back east by Lincoln, and basically he would be put in charge of the whole Union Army. And he would develop a strategy, as we will see in the coming weeks, to defeat Lee. And it worked out. It didn't work out quite as fast as he wanted it to, but it did work out in the long run. On top of that, you begin to see the South really weaken in their morale, because Sherman and Sheridan developed this strategy of total war, where they laid waste to the South. I mean, they literally laid waste to the South. So it was a huge year in the Civil War. Now, as always, I try to talk about some things that maybe you don't hear a lot about. and this is one of them. Prison camps. When the war began, it was common for both sides to treat POWs with pretty much respect and dignity. After all, we were Americans, all of us were. We were fighting against each other, and we didn't agree with what was going on. But, remember, it really was a war of brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. And as a result, in the beginning of the war, there was this system of parole exchange, which basically saw captured soldiers swapped pretty quickly. Um, all they had to do was promise they wouldn't take up arms again and what all, which nobody agreed. Nobody ever did it. They always took up arms again and went back to fight. Most of them did anyway. Um, but by 1863, that system had pretty well collapsed for a couple of reasons. Number one, remember, in 1863, the Union started using black soldiers, and the Confederacy just absolutely did not, like that. The result was they refused to parole black soldiers. On top of that, they generally executed them. I mean, it was not a good situation if you were black soldiers and you fell into the hands of the Confederacy at all. The other thing that kind of caused a problem was the fact that the Union figured out that the prisoner gap was an advantage to the South because, they were able to resupply their manpower if they got these POWs back. And so they decided maybe it's not to our advantage to be releasing these POWs. So what happened was they began to set up prisoner of war camps. And these things, folks, were horrendous. I mean, they were absolute death pads. They were terrible. Uh, when I was a high school kid, I remember picking up a book, Andersonville by McKinley Cantor, and reading it. And I was always interested in history, even as a high school student. And I remember reading this thinking, my gosh, how horrible it must have been to be in one of these prisoner of war camps. If you've never read that book, it's a long book, but it's really it's a hard book to read because it is very graphic about what happened in these prisoner of war camps. And it was really terrible. Both sides ultimately were subjected to untreated disease, unhygienic living conditions, very little food, starvation. Throughout the war, there was over about 400,000 captured soldiers housed in these camps. Again, it's one of these things that we don't hear much about anymore, but it was a really a horrendous deal. The mortality rates were actually just about equal on both sides. Since the Union won, we hear more about the southern prisoner of war camps, particularly Andersonville. But in all honesty, the Union camps were much better than the southern camps. In fact, they were just about as bad. Over 56,000 soldiers died in these camps. The most notorious was the one in Elmira Prison in New York State, which ended up being a prison, later. And death rate of about 25%. About one-fourth of every prisoner that went into a Civil War camp, prisoner of war camp, ended up dying. The Confederate camp was obviously Andersonville in Georgia, and it had a death rate of about 28%. By the way, the commandant of Andersonville, a man by the name of Henry Wirtz, was executed after the war for war crimes. I may be wrong on this, but I think he is the only general officer executed for a war crime after the Civil War because of his notorious handling of prisoners at the POW camp. So here's the description. It is a horrific photo, and I hate to show it, but folks, I want you to understand how bad these things were. This is a photograph taken of a Union soldier after he was released from Andersonville. And I mean, it's just, they're walking skeletons. And again, it wouldn't have been much better on the Union side, I'll be honest with you. Here's a description by Robert Kellogg, the 16th Regiment of Connecticut Volunteers. This is an actual description that he wrote later. He was a prisoner at Andersonville. He said, as we entered the place, Andersonville, a spectacle met our eyes that almost froze our blood with horror and made our hearts fail. Before us were forms that were now walking skeletons covered with filth and vermin. Many of the men exclaimed with earnestness, can this be hell? God protect us. In the center of the camp was a swamp, which was used by the prisoners as both a sink and a latrine. excrement covered the ground, the scent arising from which was suffocating. There were 10 deaths on our side of the camp that night. The old prisoners called it being exchanged. And truly, it was a blessed transformation to those who went from such a miserable existence on earth to a glorious one. I, it's just astounding what these prisoners went through in these camps. We talk a lot about the Holocaust, and rightfully so. I'm not for sure we did too much better at Andersonville, I'll be honest, and Elmira. Okay, the Civil War. Let's get into some of the battles of the beginning of 1864. Remember, most of the troops kind of go into winter quarters, but the South, particularly, you've got Grant and Sherman down here now in charge of Chattanooga, and that's in the South, and the Deep South is a little bit warmer. So Grant was not the one to sit around, and he thought, hey, I'm not going to sit around and just wait for spring to come and go fight. So he ordered Sherman to take some troops, leave Chattanooga, head south to Meridian, Mississippi. And if you can see down here, I've got it earmarked on the map. Meridian's about halfway between Jackson and Selma. It's a railroad line. It's an extremely important railroad depot. On top of that, it was also a manufacturing center, a weapons manufacturing center. From there, Sherman was going to, after he destroyed Meridian and tore up the railroad so the South couldn't use it, he was going to head south in an attempt to free Mobile Bay, which is one of the last remaining seaports, that is open at this point. So that was Sherman's attempt in the Meridian campaign. So let's look at what happened now. Chattanooga safely in control of the Union forces. Grant orders Sherman to take over 20,000 cavalry troops into northern Mississippi to try and capture and destroy the important manufacturing railroad hub of Meridian, which lay about 100 miles east of Jackson, the state capital. And there he was to proceed to Mobile and capture that important city. Now, Davis saw what was happening, the president of the Confederacy, and he ordered Leonidas Polk. Remember, he's the fighting parson. He orders Polk to proceed to Meridian to defend the city. But when Polk gets there, he learns how many troops Sherman has, and he knows he can't defend it. So he basically lost his nerve and abandoned the city. And when Sherman got to Meridian, he absolutely wiped it off the face of the map. I mean, Meridian was totally destroyed. This was kind of a prelude to what he would do later in the year in his march to the sea to Savannah. And what happened was Sherman's troops destroyed 115 miles of railroad, 61 bridges, 6,000 plus feet of trestle, 20 locomotives, 28 rail cars, and 3 steam mills. He absolutely destroyed everything that could be associated with railroad. And then he went on and destroyed a whole bunch more. It said upon leaving the destroyed city, Sherman telegraphed Grant, Meridian with its depots, storehouses, arsenal, hospitals, offices, hotels, and cantonments no longer exist. He basically wiped it off the face of the earth. The plan was for Sherman then to head south to Mobile. This is what they were supposed to do, is head to Mobile and take over that Gulf, that seaport on the Gulf. But just as he was getting ready to leave, Grant was ordered back east to take control of the whole Union Army. And he wanted Sherman to head back to Chattanooga because now he's going to place Sherman in charge of all the troops, the Army of the West. So now, at this point on, you've got Grant in charge of the whole Union Army, not just the Western armies anymore. He's going to be in charge of everything, and he's heads back east to Washington, D.C. to assume command. And Sherman is given charge of all the Western armies, which he will not stay in the West. He will go east across the mountains into Georgia, as we'll see. This is a photograph. I don't know that this is Meridian. I think, as I recall, this may have been a photograph that was taken on his way to Atlanta. But it demonstrates what they did. The Union soldiers were just tearing up railroads right and left. They did this. Sherman's army did this from now on. Everywhere they went, they would destroy the railroad because he was determined to fight what was called a total war. He knew that, he was going to have to destroy the ability of the South to wage war. And on top of that, he was going to destroy their morale in order to do it. So another event took place as Sherman is destroying Meridian. And it's one of these events that really captures the interest of people. And it's something that is really important even up to this day. And that's the saga of this Confederate ship Hundley. I bet some of you have heard about this. While Sherman's troops were laying waste to Meridian, one of the most storied events of the Civil War was taking place off the coast of Charleston. Remember, Charleston is now being blockaded. And so the Confederates wanted to break that blockade, and they weren't able to do it. They were able to run ships past it and all, but they wanted to break it. So they decided that they were going to use a brand new weapon which had been invented, and that was the submarine. Now, I didn't realize this. There was actually a submarine in the Revolutionary War. It wasn't effective, but I didn't realize that there had already been one. But this is the first one that's actually involved in warfare, the CSS Hundley. It attacks a United States warship, the Housatonic, and makes it the first successful submarine attack in history. So let's look at the Hundley. It was the brainchild of a man by the name of Horace Hundley of Tennessee. The South had offered a bounty of $50,000 for anybody that could build a successful submarine. And so he went about doing this. He was an engineer. He took a steam boiler, it's said, and converted it, a 40-foot steam boiler, converted it into a submarine. It was specifically designed to sink federal ships, and thus won this $50,000 prize. It had ballast tanks that could be flooded by hand pumps, had a conning tower, and it could hold a crew of 8, which turned hand crank propellers to make it go through the water. I'll show you a picture of the actual Hundley here in a minute. Creeps me out, okay? I can't imagine anybody being in this thing. The submarine had a checkered history. After a successful trial run in Mobile, it worked perfectly. It was sent back east by rail to Charleston. And so they tried 2 more times to make it work. And both times it sunk, and they had to get it off the bottom of the ocean. The second time, by the way, Hundley was in it himself and ended up dying. Both times the crews died. After raising her from the harbor floor, adjustments were made, and they attacked this Union warship, the Housatonic, and it proved successful. I don't think they sunk the Housatonic, but they definitely disabled it. Unfortunately, the Hundley disappeared after the attack. No one knows for sure exactly what happened, but the wreckage was not found until 1995. 1995, 30 years ago. And it was recovered in the year 2000. And if you happen to go to Charleston today, you can see it on display at the Warren Losh Conservation Center in Charleston, South Carolina. And this is the actual Hundley submarine. Can you imagine? I cannot even fathom who would have the guts to get in that thing and go under the water. I'm pretty claustrophobic to begin with, and I don't particularly care for open water. This is just about one of the worst nightmares in my life, would be imagining somebody getting into this thing and fighting. It's just I can't imagine who would have the guts to do that kind of thing. But this is the actual Hundley that they retrieved off the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean floor outside of Charleston, brought it back, and they've conserved it. I think it's now, I may be wrong about this, but I think it's now in seawater to keep it from eroding even more. I've never been there. Maybe some millions have. I've not seen it. So, as I told you, the reason for bringing Sherman back to Chattanooga was to place him in charge of the Western Army, because Grant has been called back east, because Lincoln and his cabinet have finally decided they have to get rid of Halleck. Old brains, okay? They just thought, this guy he's a good guy, he's intelligent, but he just didn't have the ability to do what they wanted to be done, which was have a comprehensive effort to fight the war. He was doing it piecemeal. And so they said, we need somebody to come in and create a uniform, comprehensive effort. And so they called Grant back east. Congress reinstated the rank of lieutenant general. That office had not been held since George Washington in the Revolutionary War, and they offered it to Grant. And Grant, of course, took it. Just imagine, folks, in 3 years, Grant has gone from a basically a failure, living off his father-in-law, being a clerk in a store that wasn't very successful, to he is now the Lieutenant General of the United States Army running the Civil War Army, the Union Army. It's just, I mean, there has been very few trajectories risen that fast in wartime. But Grant did it because he was so successful. Now, Halleck wasn't really fired. What happened was they understood that Halleck had some abilities to do things like, basically order supplies and distribution and logistics and all. So they made him chief of staff, and they put Grant in charge of the Union Army as the lieutenant general. Here's what some of the people said about Halleck at that time. It said that basically Lincoln said he had shrunk from responsibility wherever it was possible. Others weren't nearly that kind. McClellan, of all people, wrote that he was the most hopelessly stupid of all men in high position. Well, coming from McClellan, I'm not for sure that was anything to be listening to. Gideon Welles, the Secretary of Navy, said it a little bit better. He originates nothing, anticipates nothing, takes no responsibility, plans nothing, is good for nothing. I don't know how much better you could say it than that. So they promote Grant to the rank of Lieutenant General. They demote Halleck to Chief of Staff at his own request. That's how things work in the military. He was given the duties of making sure the Union Army was properly equipped, fed, reinforced, task for which he was ideally suited, and actually did a really good job for the remainder of the war. So he wasn't removed from the Army. He was just given a different job. Grant then appoints Sherman as the commander of the Army of the West, and he leaves Meade in charge of the Army of the Potomac. Everybody thought that Grant was going to fire Meade and take over the Army of the Potomac. And Grant said, no, I'm not doing that. Meade has performed very well, and I'm going to leave in charge of the Army of the Potomac. But he said, I'm not going to stay in Washington, D.C. I'm going to be a general in the field. So here's what you have now. This is the structure of the Union Army going forward. You have in the center there Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant. He is the commanding general of the whole Union Army. The Army of the Potomac, which will fight the remainder of the war in the East against Lee, is under the nominal head of General George Meade. He's the general in command of the Potomac Army of the Potomac. The general in charge of the Army of the West was General William T. Sherman. So it's these three guys now that will be the focus of the Union Army for the remainder of the Civil War. And they do a very good job. All three of them perform rather well. Now, Grant and Meade didn't have the best relationship. Okay, it was a strained relationship, and you can understand that. Like I said, Grant had no intention of sitting behind a desk like Halleck had. He said, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to go out in the field, and I'm going to run this army from the field. And so he went to the Army of the Potomac. Meade often, was overlooked in his mind. And I'm sure that when he found out what was going on, he thought, well, I'm going to be fired. I'm going to be, my army is going to be taken from me. And Meade was known to have a volcanic temper, and he was very confident in his ability. And frankly, he should have been, because he was not an incompetent leader. He was a good general. And so, but Grant realized this. And when he gets to Meade's camp, Meade basically says, hey, I'll resign. I know what's coming. And Grant said, no, you're not resigning. You're going to be in charge of the Army of the Potomac. So here's how we're going to operate. I'm going to be in charge of strategy and operational plan. I'm going to basically decide the whole strategic outcome of this war. You are in tactical control of the Eastern Army. In other words, when it comes down to fulfilling my strategy, you're in charge and you will make the decisions how best to do that. Now, was that arrangement free of any problems? Absolutely not. One historian said it was a cumbersome plan. On top of that, the two were both supremely confident in their abilities. And on top of that, they both had pretty hot tempers, particularly Meade. And they argued quite a bit, mainly over subordinates. Here's one example. One of the generals that was fighting under Meade was Phil Sheridan. Sheridan was a favorite of Sherman and Grant's. And Sheridan's temper was just about as hot as Meade's. And they apparently butted heads a lot. And in one instance, Sheridan basically was tired of being told what to do by Meade. And he said, look, why don't you just give me independent control of my cavalry and I'll go out here and I'll whip Jeb Stuart. Jeb Stuart was the big cavalry officer of the Eastern Theater and for the Confederate Army. And Meade was absolutely livid. He thought that was insubordinate. He goes to Grant and he tells Grant what's going on. He says, I want Sheridan reprimanded. And Grant said, now, wait a minute. You know, old Phil, he generally knows what he's talking about. So let him start right out and do it. And so he overruled Meade. He told Sheridan, take total control of your army, go out and find Jeb Stuart and whip him if you want to. And you know what? That's exactly what he did. He fought the Battle of Yellow Tavern in May, and it was a total victory for the Federals. And on top of that, Stuart's killed. So Sheridan ends up, he knows what he's talking about. Sheridan is an excellent cavalry officer, as it turned out. This is going to be kind of short today because I want to end here because, if I get into something else, I'm going to be doing something that I can't finish. So this is going to be kind of a short day today. But you know what they say? They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is a photograph that is taken at a meeting of the Union armies as they are preparing to launch the invasion of Virginia against Lee. It's taken at a place called Massaponax Church in the Battle of the Wilderness, which you'll hear more about next week. The photo shows Meade sitting on a church pew, looking at a map with Grant looking over his shoulder. And folks, if there's ever been a picture that demonstrates the relationship of Grant and Meade, this is it. Because what you've got is you've got Meade looking at the map, basically saying, this is what I'm going to do. But you've got Grant looking over his shoulder, making sure that he's doing what he wants him to do. So here's the photograph. And what you've got here, this is an actual photograph. You don't see a lot of photographs like this taken actually preceding a battle. But here is Grant leaning over, he's leaning over Meade's shoulder, looking at the map with him. Basically, it's worth 1,000 words. It shows the relationship between these two. Meade in charge, but Grant making sure that he's doing exactly what he wants him to do. So that's it for today. Like I said, this is going to be kind of a short session today because if I get into something else, I'm going to be getting in something I can't finish, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to start something and not finish it for the day, and I'll go over. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something today. Keep on going. Keep that mind working. Use it. Do some reading. Do something because I think that's so important. Good to see all of you. Art, good to see you. Donna, Roy, Lee.
Interesting.
Good to see you guys. And we will see you next week. Okay?
Bye-bye.
Bye.